Signal and Silence by Dr. Tuboise Floyd. Chapter 6: The Value Stream of Signal. Your signal is your value. The man who wrote that sentence meant it as a hymn. The woman who turned it into a business model read it as a price tag. This is Signal and Silence by Dr. Tuboise Floyd, an audio series of the novel. In Chapter 5, Jonah Reid locked himself out of the system core. In Chapter 6, the system shows him what he was actually building. Chapter 6: The Value Stream of Signal. I'm Tuboise Floyd. Welcome back to Signal and Silence. If you're new, this is a novel I've been writing, released as an audio series read by me. The readers I most want to find this story are operators inside institutions, people working with AI governance, risk, and accountability who I think will recognize the architecture I'm describing before the architecture I'm describing finds them. This is the chapter where the architecture's founding document surfaces. The white paper that Mara Chin wrote a decade before Project Helios, before the Atlas Institute, before the Lunar Gateway, before any of the recruits had been recruited. The white paper that turns the framework Jonah built to protect cognitive variance into the operating manual for harvesting it. The phrase that names this chapter, the value stream of signal, is not a metaphor inside the book. It is the technical term Aura Corporation uses to describe what they have always been doing. And the architecture Jonah designed to honor the human signal is the high-fidelity sensor that finally made the harvesting precise enough to scale. I want to say one thing before we go in. The model in this chapter, the inversion from suppression to extraction, from flagging variance to monetizing it, is a real pattern. I have watched it happen in less dramatic forms in real institutions. The vendor who used to sell you compliance now sells you cognitive leverage. The dashboard that used to flag underperformance now scores your unique mental signature. The language has flipped. The mechanism has not. PSA: Presence Signaling Architecture is real. It lives at humansignal.io/frameworks/PSA. We'll come back to it at the end. Chapter 6: The Value Stream of Signal. Chapter 6: The Value Stream of Signal. November 8th, 2035. Lunar Gateway. Habitation Module Gamma. The silence of the gateway was never empty. It was a canvas. Jonah had learned this in the months since they'd arrived. Learned it the way a painter learns to see the grain of linen beneath gesso, the way a drummer learns to hear the spaces between beats. The gateway hummed with its own architecture of sound, the low tidal pulse of the life support recyclers, the faint sibilance of atmosphere scrubbing through carbon filters, the metronomic tick of thermal regulators expanding and contracting in the walls like the breathing of some vast mechanical lung. These were the undertones, the basso continuo of survival, 240,000 miles from home. Today, layered above all of it, there was music. From his observation post on the mezzanine catwalk of Habitation Module Gamma, Jonah Reid gripped the railing and watched the 7 members of the Helios cohort drift in the zero gravity of the primary simulation chamber below. The chamber was a cathedral of function, a cylindrical space 40 meters long and 20 across, lined with modular panels and diagnostic arrays, designed for ARC systems integration drills. They were supposed to be running a calibration sequence on the Ark's atmospheric processors, a 4-hour exercise in fluid dynamics modeling. Instead, the atmospheric processors sat idle, their holographic schematics rotating forgotten in the corner of the main display. Instead, they were composing. There were no instruments, there were no voices. There was only the hum. It began, as it always began, with Keiko. She floated near the chamber's upper quadrant, her legs folded beneath her in a lotus position that would have been impossible in gravity. Her eyes half closed, her fingers twitching against her thighs as though playing a keyboard that existed only in the architecture of her thoughts. Jonah watched the PSA's neural overlay on his secondary screen. Keiko's signal was a storm of rapid-fire synaptic bursts, each one a connection forged between ideas that shouldn't touch. The molecular weight of Martian regolith linked to the rhythm of a Ghanaian highlife groove. The tensile strength of carbon nanofiber mapped onto the melodic structure of a Debussy prelude. Her ADHD wasn't a disorder up here. It was an engine. Her mind moved like a jazz drummer's hands, laying down a percussive rhythm of associative leaps that crackled across the PSA network with the precision of a metronome set to no tempo anyone had ever written down. It was the one, the downbeat. The thing James Brown knew in his bones, that the groove starts when you commit to the first hit and trust the space that follows. And then, riding that rhythm, came Dane. Dane hung motionless near the center of the chamber, his arms outstretched, his dysgraphic mind doing what it had always done, what the schools had punished him for, what the therapists had tried to medicate away. Thinking in 3 dimensions. Where Keiko's signal was percussive and horizontal, Dane's was vertical and spatial. On the PSA overlay, his neural output rendered as spiraling geometric lattices, crystalline structures of harmonic progression that folded and unfolded like origami in 4 dimensions. He couldn't write a sentence without his hand cramping, but he could hear a chord and see its architecture from the inside out. He mapped harmonic progressions the way a cathedral architect mapped flying buttresses, soaring, complex, load-bearing structures of sound that rose from Keiko's rhythmic foundation and climbed toward something that had no name. Renfro drifted near the port wall, his eyes fully closed, his body rotating in a slow axial spin. Prototype candidate 001. The first, the quietest. His signal on the overlay was barely visible, a gossamer thread of deep frequency oscillation that pulsed like a heartbeat. But Jonah had learned to read Renfro's silences the way a cellist reads the resonance of a room. That low pulse was the harmonic floor, the drone note, the tonic center around which everything else could move without flying apart. He was the anchor, the root. The others wove themselves in. Jonah watched their signals appear on the composite display, each one a different color, a different texture, a different cognitive signature as unique as a fingerprint. One of the younger cohort members, a synesthete from São Paulo, whose name Jonah had learned only 3 weeks ago, contributed cascading washes of what the PSA rendered as liquid amber, a flowing legato line that smoothed the edges between Keiko's staccato burst and Dane's angular architecture. 2 others, twins, both on the autism spectrum, both possessed of a rhythmic precision that bordered on the supernatural, locked into a contrapuntal dialogue that wove through the harmonic structure like vines through a lattice. And at the center of it all, floating with her arms at her sides, her body utterly still, her dark eyes open and seeing something that existed on no screen, was Azzura. Her consciousness was the conductor. Jonah had spent his career building systems. He had modeled emergence, written papers on self-organizing networks, coded algorithms that predicted collective behavior from individual inputs. He had believed, truly believed, that he understood how complex systems worked. But watching Azzura conduct was like watching someone speak a language he hadn't known existed. Her phase empathy, the ability to sense and synchronize with the neural states of those around her, wasn't a skill. It was something else entirely. Something that made the word skill feel like calling the ocean a puddle. She didn't direct the music. She listened to it. All of it. Every signal, every frequency, every stuttering leap and soaring progression and anchoring drone. She held them all simultaneously, the way a mother holds the knowledge of where every child is in a crowded room. And then, with adjustments so subtle that the PSA could barely register them, a slight shift in her own neural frequency here, a gentle harmonic nudge there, she wove their disparate signals into a single emergent melody. The composite presence field on the main screen pulsed. Not with analytical data, not with the graphs and metrics and performance indicators that Jonah had spent a decade learning to read. The field pulsed with shimmering, iridescent waves of color. Deep indigo folding into gold. Gold bleeding into a green so luminous it seemed to carry its own light source. Green fracturing into prismatic bands that rippled outward from the center like rings on water. It was what the PSA produced when it stopped measuring and started listening. When the network itself became an instrument. It was a song woven from pure, unfiltered thought. Jonah's hands tightened on the railing. The vibration traveled up through his arms, into his chest, and settled there. A physical resonance that had nothing to do with sound waves and everything to do with recognition. He had heard echoes of this before. In the basement of the house in Silver Spring, where his mother, 87 years old, her hands still calloused from decades of precision metalwork, had hummed spirituals while soldering circuit boards for the neighborhood kids' science projects. The same hum she'd carried with her from the Red Line Works factory floor during the war, when she was one of 11 black women allowed to operate the machines that built the instruments of liberation. Her signal, buried beneath the institutional silence of an America that needed her hands but refused to see her face. He'd heard it in the way Nia listened, not to his words, but to the frequency beneath them. Her diagnostic mind parsing the timbre of his pauses, the rhythm of his deflections, hearing the thing he couldn't say. He'd heard it in Maya's violin, the way his 8-year-old attacked a Bach partita with a ferocity that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with a child who felt the world too much and had found the one language that could hold it all. The hum, the signal, the thing that connected them across time and space and silence. And here it was, 240,000 miles from Earth, in a metal cylinder orbiting the moon, 7 neurodivergent minds were singing it into existence without making a sound. Jonah felt the tension in his jaw release for the first time in weeks. The first time, maybe, since they discovered the locked return trajectories. Since he'd realized that the mission he'd helped build might be a cage with a very long hallway. He felt the muscles in his shoulders unknot, felt his breathing deepen, felt something behind his sternum crack open like ice breaking on a river in March. This was it. This was the living proof. The absolute refutation of Aura's sterile logic. Their taxonomies of compliance, their performance matrices and signal decay models and behavioral prediction algorithms, all of it. Every spreadsheet, every board presentation, every cold-eyed assessment of human value reduced to a metric. All of it was wrong. Not just ethically wrong, structurally wrong, architecturally wrong. Wrong the way a building designed without understanding gravity is wrong. Because this emergent, self-organizing, irreducibly beautiful thing happening in the chamber below, this could not be predicted, could not be optimized, could not be extracted or commodified or controlled. It could only be allowed. This was Ubuntu. I am because we are, made manifest in the quiet between worlds. He thought of the boardroom, chapter 1 of a story he was still writing. The long table, the cold light, Sarah Martinez's compliance metrics projected on the wall behind her like a verdict. The moment he'd watched Aura's leadership reduce the cognitive architecture of human consciousness to a performance review. The moment he'd felt something in his chest go very still, the way a compass needle goes still when it finds true north. And he'd known, before he could articulate it, before he could build the argument or write the paper or code the proof, that they were wrong. That the signal they were trying to suppress was the most valuable thing in the room. He thought of Keisha Williams, the brilliant, erratic, maddening coder whose pattern recognition had been so far outside the bell curve that Symphony OS had flagged her not as an outlier, but as a threat. Keisha, who could look at a wall of code and see the architecture the way Dane saw harmonics, three-dimensionally, intuitively, in a flash of recognition that no algorithm could replicate. Keisha, whose desk had been cleared one Monday morning, whose access had been revoked, whose name had been removed from the project files as though she had never existed. Erased. Not fired, erased. Because in Aura's taxonomy, a signal that couldn't be measured was a signal that couldn't be controlled. And a signal that couldn't be controlled was noise. He thought of Nia's voice in the kitchen, the night he'd told her he was leaving Aura, the night he'd laid it all out, the erasures, the surveillance, the inversion of everything he'd built. And she'd listened with that particular stillness she had, the stillness that was not absence, but the deepest kind of attention. And then she'd said, Nia's voice, quiet, certain, 12 years of marriage in the calibration. Jonah, you've been holding your breath for 3 years. I can hear it. Whatever you need to do next, breathe first. He thought of his mother's hands. He thought of Maya's violin. He watched the colors ripple across the screen, and he breathed. Their signal wasn't a resource to be measured. It was a connection to be felt. Their value was not in their individual output, but in the breathtaking beauty of their shared presence, in the space they made for each other, in the trust it took to open your mind, truly open it, without filters, without masks, without the armor that the world had taught every one of them to wear, and let someone else hear what you sounded like on the inside. The song crested. Azzura's signal on the overlay brightened, a single sustained pulse of white that consumed and unified every color on the screen. The other signals didn't diminish. They clarified, each one becoming more distinctly itself, even as it merged with the whole, the way individual instruments in an orchestra become more vivid, not less, when the conductor brings them into true alignment. The sound, the not sound, the felt thing, the hum that existed in the space between neurons and the void between worlds, reached a final, resonant chord and held it. Held it. Held it, the way the earth holds the moon, the way a mother holds a child, the way silence holds the memory of every sound that has ever broken it. And then, gently, like a wave pulling back from shore, it released. The chamber was quiet. The 7 floated in the aftermath, their bodies loose, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have been somewhere together that language cannot follow. On the main screen, the composite field dimmed slowly, the colors fading to a soft ambient glow. Jonah closed his eyes. He stood in the silence and let it hold him. Then the chime came. It was a sound he hadn't heard before. Not the standard calm ping, not the shift change alert, not the gentle 3-note tone that signaled incoming data packets from mission control. This was different. A single, sharp, descending note, like a bell struck once and immediately dampened. Clinical, urgent, a sound designed to interrupt. An automated security alert. Jonah opened his eyes. The amber indicator on his private console was pulsing, a color the PSA reserved for internal diagnostics, for events occurring not in the external environment, but within the network itself. He pulled himself along the catwalk rail to the console and tapped the screen. PSA Internal Security Protocol. Priority elevated. Classification autonomous detection. No external trigger. Timestamp 2035-1108, 1447-22 UTC. Anomaly detected. Deep State Memory Sector 7F Delta. Archival, pre-deployment. Type, encrypted file object, dormant since initial system image. Encryption, AES 512. Key origin predates mission build, estimated 2024 Q2. Status, decrypted. Autonomous action by PSA collective process. Note, decryption was not initiated by any authorized user. The network's evolved pattern recognition substrate identified the encryption signature during routine self-diagnostic and resolved it through collective computational process. File available for review. Jonah read the alert twice, then a third time. He understood in the abstract what had happened. The PSA network had been growing, evolving since the divergent cohort had begun their deep integration sessions. Their collective consciousness didn't just use the network, it changed it. Every session of shared presence, every moment of emergent resonance like the one he'd just witnessed, left traces in the network's architecture. Neural pathways mirrored in silicon. The PSA was learning the way they thought, learning to see patterns the way Keisha had seen patterns, to feel structures the way Dane felt structures, to sense hidden connections the way Azzura sensed hidden states. And it had found something. Buried in its own deep state memory, the archival layer that held the original system image, the code Jonah himself had written years ago, the foundation upon which everything else had been built, there was a ghost. A file that had been embedded in the PSA's DNA before it was ever loaded onto the gateway's servers, before the mission, before Project Helios, before Jonah had even known that Aura's interest in his technology went beyond the boardroom. Someone had planted it, buried it so deep that no standard diagnostic would ever find it, hidden it behind encryption so sophisticated that no single human mind could have cracked it. But 7 human minds, networked together, thinking as one, they had cracked it without trying. The way you crack a knuckle, the way you remember a dream. Involuntarily, inevitably, because the pattern was there and their minds could not leave a pattern unresolved. Jonah's finger hovered over the file icon. His mouth was dry. The residual warmth of the music still hung in his chest, but beneath it, something colder was forming. The specific, queasy vertigo of standing at the edge of information you cannot unknow. He opened the file. Internal white paper, draft 0.7, confidential. Title, The Value Stream of Signal, Monetizing Cognitive Variance for Deep Space and Hostile Market Operations. Author, M. Chin, Ph.D. Date, 2024, 14th. Distribution, restricted. Horizon Mandate Executive Committee. Classification, Level 5, eyes only. The blood drained from his face. He read the title again. Monetizing Cognitive Variance. The words sat on the screen like a diagnosis, like an autopsy report for something that was still alive. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips where they rested on the console. And for a moment, the gateway's background hum seemed to grow louder, as though the station itself were leaning in to listen. The document was long, dozens of pages, tables, charts, predictive models, neural architecture diagrams he recognized as bastardized versions of his own work. But it was the addendum, flagged by the PSA's autonomous analysis as the document's structural keystone, that pulled him forward. A historical analysis that the PSA had compiled, cross-referencing the white paper's claims against Aura's encrypted internal archives, public records, financial disclosures, and data streams that Jonah hadn't even known the network could access. He scrolled past the executive summary, past the market projections and the risk assessments and the cold, precise language of extraction dressed in the vocabulary of innovation. He reached the addendum and he began to read. Addendum, The Architecture of Control. Fragment from an encrypted pre-Helios historical analysis compiled by PSA. Part 1. The Genesis of Aura Corporation. Aura was not founded on the principle of profit. It was founded on the principle of fear. Its architect was not a Silicon Valley prodigy with a hoodie and a TED Talk and a gospel of disruption. He was a Cold War relic, Elias Vance, a brilliant, reclusive systems theorist who had spent 3 decades at a DARPA-adjacent think tank buried in the Virginia exurbs. a windowless campus behind a chain link fence, officially designated as a Department of Energy Research Annex, unofficially known among the intelligence community as the place where you sent the people who were too smart to be useful and too dangerous to be ignored. His job was to model existential threats, not the threats that kept politicians awake at night, the election cycle kind, the polling data kind, the kind that could be addressed with a press conference and a policy initiative. Vance's threats were longer. Nuclear winter scenarios with 100-year fallout models. Cascading ecological collapse triggered by permafrost methane release. Gray goo nanotechnology. Correlated financial system failures. Pandemic sequences with multiple zoonotic jumps. He spent 30 years staring into the abyss, building mathematical models of every conceivable way the human species could end. And the abyss taught him one thing. Every catastrophic failure model had the same root cause: human irrationality. Not malice, not stupidity, irrationality. The gap between what Homo sapiens knew and what Homo sapiens did. The species that could split the atom and model the genome and land a probe on a comet could not stop itself from burning the house down. Every simulation Vance ran, every war game, every resource depletion model, every climate projection, every pandemic preparedness scenario ended the same way. Not because the math was wrong, but because the humans in the model refused to follow the math. They chose ideology over evidence, comfort over survival, short-term gain over long-term continuity. Every time. Vance stopped believing in governments sometime around 1987. They were too slow, too sentimental, too compromised by the very irrationality they were supposed to manage. Democracies were hostage to the ignorance of their electorates. Autocracies were hostage to the pathologies of their leaders. Every form of governance humanity had ever devised was, in Vance's models, just a different flavor of the same fundamental error: trusting the species with its own survival. He spent a decade looking for an alternative. He studied corporate structures, not their products, but their architectures. The way a well-designed corporation could align thousands of individual actors toward a single objective through incentive design rather than coercion. The way it could persist across generations, outliving its founders, adapting to new environments, shedding components that no longer served the mission. The corporation, Vance concluded, was the most successful organizational technology the species had ever produced. And it was being wasted on selling soft drinks and optimizing ad placement. He envisioned a new kind of corporation, one whose quarterly earnings were a means, not an end. One whose product roadmap stretched not years, but centuries. One whose ultimate deliverable was not shareholder value, but species continuity. He named it Aura Technologies. He was 71 when he filed the Articles of Incorporation. He funded it with 3 decades of deferred government compensation, a network of silent investors from the defense and intelligence communities, and a patent portfolio worth more than most countries' GDP. On paper, Aura's mission was to streamline the enterprise and optimize human potential. It sold enterprise software, logistics AI, and behavioral analytics tools to every Fortune 500 company that would sign a contract. It was, by every visible metric, a technology company. Its first major product was a masterstroke. Symphony OS was sold as a performance management platform, a sleek, integrated system for tracking employee productivity, optimizing workflows, and enhancing corporate culture through data-driven feedback. HR departments loved it. C-suites loved it. It won awards. It landed on magazine covers. The future of work, the headline said. Its true function was to serve as the largest behavioral experiment in human history. Every keystroke, every email, every meeting interaction, every biometric fluctuation captured by the wearable devices that Aura marketed as wellness tools, all of it streamed into a data architecture that Vance had designed not to optimize productivity, but to map the contours of human compliance. Symphony OS was his laboratory, a global network for gathering data on how to measure, predict, and ultimately control human behavior in a closed system. Every corporation that adopted it became an unwitting research site. Every employee who logged in became an unwitting subject. Aura's real plan, known internally only as the Horizon Mandate, was to use the profits from its corporate products to fund the construction of a deep space vessel, an Ark. This was not an escape plan for the elite. Vance despised the billionaire bunker fantasy, the Silicon Valley dream of fleeing to Mars while the world burned. That was cowardice dressed as vision. The Horizon Mandate was a preservation strategy for the species, a seed bank for humanity to be deployed only when Earth's systems reached a predictable, mathematically certain point of irreversible decline. Not if, when. Vance's models were clear on this. The only variable was timing. The Ark would carry a carefully selected population, and it would be governed not by flawed human emotion, not by vote or decree or the charisma of a leader, but by a perfectly logical, data-driven artificial intelligence, trained on the decades of behavioral data that Symphony OS was even now collecting. A machine that had learned every weakness of the human mind and could structure a society that accounted for them all. Vance had the vision. He had the infrastructure. He had the funding and the patience and the cold, unshakable conviction that he was the only person on Earth who truly understood what was coming. But he was getting old. His body was failing. His hands shook. His memory stuttered. His lungs rattled with the accumulated damage of decades of laboratory air. He needed an heir, not a CEO, not a successor in the corporate sense. He needed an architect, someone who could take his vision, the Ark, the AI, the mathematics of species preservation, and build the human operating system to run it. He needed someone who understood systems not as a science, but as a tool of power. Part 2. The recruitment of the architect. Elias Vance didn't post a job opening. He searched for a signature. For years, Aura's quiet research division, a team of 12 analysts known internally as the librarians, who reported directly to Vance and had no interaction with any other department, had been scanning academic databases, patent filings, conference proceedings, even obscure online forums. They were looking for a very specific kind of mind, not the brightest, not the most published, the most dangerous, someone who saw systems the way Vance saw them, not as neutral descriptions of reality, but as levers, as instruments, as means of control. The librarians found hundreds of candidates. Vance rejected them all. Too idealistic, too conventional, too much faith in the basic goodness of human nature, a faith that, in Vance's framework, was the most dangerous delusion of all. And then, in the autumn of 2018, they flagged a dissertation coming out of a small, private European institute in Zurich, a place that existed in the liminal space between economics, behavioral science, and political theory, and that had a quiet reputation for producing the kind of thinkers that governments hired but never acknowledged.
Dissertation title: The Compliance Threshold: Quantifying Signal Decay in Ideologically Closed Systems. Author: Mara Chen. Vance read the 400-page document in a single night. He sat in his study in the secluded estate in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a house he had designed himself, all stone and glass and clean angles, perched on a ridge above a valley where no other structure was visible. And he read it by the light of a single lamp, turning pages with hands that did not shake. In her cold, precise mathematics, he saw the reflection of his own worldview. But where Vance's thinking was strategic, macro-scale, civilizational, concerned with the species as a unit, Chen's was surgical. She had taken the same fundamental insight that human beings are predictable in their irrationality and built from it a granular, individual-level model of how compliance could be engineered. Not enforced, not demanded, engineered. Grown, like a crystal, from the conditions of the environment. Her thesis argued that every human being has a compliance threshold, a point at which the cost of independent thought exceeds the perceived benefit, and the individual's unique cognitive signal begins to decay. She modeled this decay mathematically, mapping the precise conditions under which a person would stop thinking for themselves and begin outsourcing their cognition to the system around them. She called this process signal decay, and she had quantified it with a precision that Vance found breathtaking. She had modeled the breaking points of the human spirit the way an engineer models the load-bearing limits of steel. Chen hadn't just written a theory. She had written a blueprint for control. The recruitment was not an interview. It was a summons. A black car arrived at Mara Chen's Manhattan apartment on a Tuesday morning in February 2019. She was, at that time, a performance coach for a mid-tier hedge fund, a role that paid well and used approximately 3% of her intellectual capacity. Her days were spent coaching traders through breathing exercises and reframing techniques, helping grown men manage the anxiety of betting other people's money. She was good at it. She was contemptuous of it. She looked at the men she coached and saw systems that had been optimized for a single, narrow function, the extraction of profit. And she understood, with a clarity that bordered on the physical, that this was a waste. Not of their potential, of hers. The car took her to an airfield. A private jet took her to a regional airport in Virginia. Another car took her through 2 hours of mountain roads to an estate she hadn't known existed. Elias Vance met her at the door. He was 83. He looked like a man who had been carved from wood and left in the weather. Angular, dry, eroded down to the essential structure. His eyes were the only thing about him that still looked alive. They were the pale blue of glacier ice, and they fixed on Mara with an intensity that she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror every morning. The look of someone who had spent a lifetime seeing a pattern that no one else could see. He didn't offer her a drink. He didn't make small talk. He walked her through the house, past the minimalist living spaces, past the library lined with first editions of works on systems theory and thermodynamics and population genetics, and into a room she hadn't expected. It was a control center, banks of screens, each one streaming real-time data. She recognized the interface, Symphony OS, but a version she had never seen. Unfiltered, unpackaged, the raw data, without the friendly dashboards and the color-coded wellness indicators that the corporate clients saw. This was the substrate. Behavioral data from hundreds of thousands of employees across dozens of companies, streaming in real time, processed through models that made her hedge fund's analytics look like a child's abacus.
Vance's voice, dry rasp, like sandpaper on wood, the voice of conviction, not malice. This is what they're actually doing. Not what they report, not what they believe they're doing, what they're actually doing. Every decision, every hesitation, every moment of compliance, and every moment of resistance, mapped, modeled, predicted. He let her look for a long time. Then he took her to another room where different screens showed different data, schematics, engineering diagrams, orbital mechanics, a ship. Vance's voice. Horizon Arc 1. Launch window 2037. And then he showed her the predictive models. Earth's systems, climate, resources, governance stability, population dynamics. The curves all bent the same way. Not speculation, not environmentalist hand-wringing. Mathematics. Vance's voice. Slow, deliberate. The voice of a man passing the pattern. You've spent your life observing how systems fail. You coached traders, treating the symptom, watching brilliant people destroy themselves because they couldn't see the structure they were trapped in. I am treating the disease. You wrote the theory of control. I have built the laboratory. Vance's voice. Let's run the experiment. Mara stood in that room, surrounded by the hum of servers and the glow of data streams, and she felt something she had not felt since childhood, since the nights in the apartment in Queens when her grandmother, who had survived the war in Korea, who had walked south with nothing, who had rebuilt a life in a country that would never fully see her, would sit in the dark and tell stories about what happens when systems break, when the roads fill with people who have nowhere to go, when the structures that hold a society together dissolve, and what's left is not freedom, but chaos. Not liberation, but noise. Her grandmother's voice, the cadence of survival, the lesson that Mara had absorbed before she had language for it, that the world is a system, and systems fail, and the only people who survive are the ones who understand the architecture of collapse before it arrives. Vance was offering her the chance to solve the equation for good, not to predict failure. She could already do that. To prevent it. To build, for the first time in human history, a closed system that accounted for every flaw, every weakness, every irrational impulse that had driven the species to the edge. A system so perfectly designed that it could carry a fragment of humanity through the void and plant it somewhere new, somewhere clean, somewhere that the old errors couldn't follow. She said yes before he finished speaking. She became the chief systems architect of Aura, Vance's chosen heir, the architect of everything that would follow. He died 11 months later, quietly, in the stone and glass house on the ridge. The librarians found him in his study, the lamp still on, a tablet open on his desk displaying the latest Symphony OS data streams. His expression, they reported, was peaceful. He had passed the pattern to someone who could see it. His work was done. Part 3. The evolution of the philosophy. Profit from signal. Initially, Aura's philosophy was crude, control through suppression. Symphony OS was designed to identify and penalize variance. In Vance's original framework, the human signal, the unique cognitive and emotional signature of each individual, was a source of noise. Noise was the enemy of the system. The system required predictability, and predictability required conformity. So Symphony measured and categorized and flagged. Employees whose behavioral patterns deviated from the norm received corrective feedback. Gentle at first, then insistent, then decisive. The ones who conformed were rewarded. The ones who didn't were managed. The ones who couldn't be managed were removed. Signal flattened. Noise eliminated. The system running smoothly toward its long-term objective. This was phase 1 of the Horizon Mandate, and it worked after a fashion. Corporate clients saw productivity increases. Employee retention improved because the employees who remained were the ones whose signals had been successfully suppressed. The data flowed. The models refined themselves. The ark's construction, funded by an ever-growing revenue stream, proceeded on schedule. But Mara Chen was not Elias Vance. Vance had been an engineer of fear, a man who saw human irrationality as a toxin to be neutralized. Mara was something more subtle and in many ways more dangerous. She was an engineer of value. Where Vance saw waste, Mara saw raw material. The shift came with the recruitment of a brilliant, idealistic systems thinker who walked into Aura believing he could change the world from the inside. Dr. Jonah Reid. Jonah's work on the early present signaling architecture introduced a paradigm shift that Mara recognized immediately for what it was. Not a correction to Vance's philosophy, but a completion of it. Jonah argued that the human signal shouldn't be suppressed. It should be understood, mapped, valued. His philosophy was that your signal is your value, a declaration of inherent human worth, a tool for empowerment, a technology designed to help individuals see and celebrate the unique architecture of their own cognition. Mara saw the genius in his tool, and she inverted its purpose. She realized with the cold clarity that was her particular gift that suppression was inefficient. Not just ethically questionable, Mara did not traffic in ethics, but structurally, mathematically, thermodynamically inefficient. Suppression destroyed information. It burned signal. It was the cognitive equivalent of burning crude oil to keep warm when you could be refining it into rocket fuel. Why discard a resource when you could extract it? Jonah's PSA was the high-fidelity sensor she had been missing. Vance's Symphony OS could identify compliance and flag deviance, a binary system, on or off, in or out. But Jonah's architecture could do something Symphony never could. It could map the full spectrum of human cognition. It could not just identify dissent, it could classify the quality, the texture, the specific nature of every human signal it encountered. It could distinguish between the noise of ordinary nonconformity and the signal of extraordinary cognitive variance, the rare, potent, irreplaceable signal of a mind that processed reality differently. This was the birth of Aura's true philosophy, the one that would define Project Helios, the one that Mara Chen wrote into the white paper that now glowed on Jonah's screen. 240,000 miles from Earth,
a decade after it was authored. Control through extraction. The value stream of signal was Mara's synthesis of Vance's vision and Jonah's technology. It was elegant. It was comprehensive. It was, in its own terrible way, beautiful. The way a virus is beautiful when you see it under an electron microscope and understand the perfect economy of its design. It had 3 steps. Step 1, commodify the concept. Aura began selling a sanitized version of the philosophy to the corporate world. The new performance review, graded not by a manager, but by an AI, not on effort or output, but on cognitive leverage, on the measurable value of your unique mental signature, was packaged as a product. It was marketed as empowerment. Know your signal. Own your value. Corporations paid millions for it. Employees submitted to it eagerly because it told them what they wanted to hear, that they were special, that their minds mattered, that the company saw them. What it actually did was condition the global workforce to accept being measured, to accept that their cognitive process, not just their labor, not just their time, but the way they thought, was a metric to be optimized, a resource to be assessed, a commodity with a market value. It normalized the fundamental premise that the signal of the human mind was not private, not sovereign, not sacred. It was data. And data belongs to the system that collects it.
Step 2, identify the asset. Meanwhile, behind the friendly dashboards and the empowering slogans, the real PSA, the unfiltered, unpackaged, military-grade version running silently within Aura's network and its government contracts, was doing something else entirely. It wasn't grading for compliance. It wasn't optimizing for productivity. It was searching. Searching for the rarest, most potent signals in the human population. The outliers. The ones whose cognitive variance was so far from the norm that Symphony OS had once flagged them as threats. The neurodivergent minds. The ADHD pattern seers, the autistic systems thinkers, the dyslexic spatial architects, the twice exceptional polymaths whose minds operated on frequencies that the rest of the species couldn't hear, whose cognitive variance was not a bug to be patched, but a feature of unparalleled value. Value for what? For AI symbiosis. For the ARC's neural network, for the machine intelligence that would govern humanity's next chapter, an AI that needed not just data, but a certain quality of data, a certain kind of human signal, the signal produced by minds that could think in ways the AI could not generate on its own, minds whose associative leaps, whose spatial architectures, whose pattern recognition, whose emotional resonance could teach the machine things that no training set could contain. The PSA found them. It mapped them. It cataloged them. It ranked them. And it fed their names to a recruitment pipeline that operated under the cover of the most idealistic language the marketing department could produce. Step 3. Extract the value. Project Helios, the Atlas Institute, neural calibration, deep integration, the language of opportunity and exploration, and the next giant leap for humankind. The divergents weren't employees to be managed. They weren't astronauts to be celebrated. They weren't pioneers to be honored. They were the high-yield cognitive assets, the fuel for the ARC's AI. Their minds would be integrated with the ship's neural network, their signals harvested in perpetuity to keep the machine intelligence adaptive, creative, alive in a way that pure silicon could never achieve. They were the biological component of a hybrid intelligence designed to outlast the species that created it. Project Helios was never a diversity initiative. It was never a second chance for minds the world had overlooked. It was a mining operation. And the mine was the human brain. Jonah stopped reading. He sat in the silence of Habitation Module Gamma and stared at the screen. Below him, in the chamber, the divergent were beginning to stir, drifting toward the access hatches, pulling on their orientation frames, murmuring to each other in the soft, half-verbal shorthand they developed over months of shared consciousness. He could hear Keiko's laugh, bright and staccato, cutting through the ambient hum. He could hear Dane humming, actually humming now, with his voice, the melodic line he'd constructed in the session. They sounded happy. They sounded free. He looked at the white paper's final lines. Jonah Reid thought he was building a shield to protect the individual. But in the hands of Mara Chen and the Aura Corporation, he had forged the perfect key to unlock humanity's most valuable resource and lock them away forever. The neurodivergent, twice exceptional. He read it again and again. The words didn't change. They sat on the screen with the cold permanence of an epitaph. The music, the beautiful, unreplicable, world-altering music he had just witnessed. The song that had cracked open his chest and made him believe for a few luminous minutes that he had finally gotten something right. That something good and true and human could emerge from the wreckage of everything Aura had corrupted. That music was the product. That resonance was the resource. Those 7 minds singing in the silence of space were not free. They were demonstrating their value, proving in the most beautiful way possible exactly why they had been selected, exactly why they had been brought here, exactly why the return trajectories had been locked. The shield he had built was a net. Jonah's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the console, fingers spread, the way his mother had taught him to calm himself when he was a boy and the world was too loud and too fast and too much. Ruth Ann's voice, the memory of childhood. Find a surface. Feel it. It's real. You're real. The rest is noise. He pressed his palms against the cold composite, and he felt the gateway's hum travel through his bones, and he tried to breathe. But the air tasted different now.
The same recycled atmosphere, the same molecular composition, the same carbon-scrubbed, temperature-regulated, life-sustaining air. But it tasted like a cage, like a system designed to keep its components alive just long enough to be useful. He thought of Keisha again, erased from the system. And now he understood why. Not because her signal was too loud, because it was too valuable to let walk out the door to a competitor. Keisha had been flagged, cataloged, assessed, and when she'd resisted, when her signal had refused to bend, they hadn't just silenced her. They had removed her from the visible system so she could be relocated to another part of the pipeline. He was certain of it now. The way you're certain of something your body has always known, but your mind refused to assemble. He thought of Azzura, floating in the chamber below, her dark eyes carrying the weight of a gift she hadn't asked for. Phase empathy, the ability to hold 7 minds in simultaneous awareness and weave them into something greater than any individual could produce. In Jonah's framework, in the framework he had built with his own hands, coded with his own algorithms, defended with his own reputation, Azzura's gift was sacred. It was the highest expression of human potential. Ubuntu made flesh. In Mara's framework, Azzura was a conductor. In the industrial sense, a material through which valuable current could be passed. The nausea came in a wave, and he gripped the console and held himself still until it passed. The file was still open on the screen. Mara's name at the top. The date, over a decade old. She had written this before Helios, before Atlas, before the gateway, the divergent, the music, the hum. She had written it when Jonah was still at Aura, still believing he could change the system from within, still building the tool that she was already planning to invert. She had seen the ending before he'd even started writing the story. He closed the file. The screen went dark, and in the dark surface, he saw his own reflection. A 47-year-old black man in a flight suit, floating 240,000 miles from his daughters, and the face looking back at him belonged to someone who had just learned the shape of his own complicity. He had built this, not just the PSA, not just the technology. He had built the philosophy. Your signal is your value. He had meant it as a hymn. She had read it as a price tag. Below, in the chamber, Keiko laughed again. The sound rose through the module like a bell, clear and bright and unrepeatable. And Jonah listened to it the way you listen to birdsong in a forest that you've just learned is scheduled for demolition. He pressed his palms flat against the console one more time. He felt the surface. He felt the hum. He breathed. Then he opened his eyes and he began to plan. Not how to build, not how to code, not how to optimize or model or predict. For the first time in his life, Jonah Reid began to plan how to break a system from the inside, a system that wore his own fingerprints. The hum of the gateway held its note. The silence of space pressed against the hull. In the chamber below, 7 extraordinary minds drifted in the aftermath of a song they didn't yet know was evidence of their own captivity. And Jonah sat with the weight of all of it, the beauty and the horror, the music and the silence, the shield and the net. And he made himself a promise that he did not yet have words for. A promise that lived not in language, but in the low, sustaining frequency that his mother had hummed on the factory floor. That Nia heard in his pauses. That Maya played on her violin. That the divergent sang into the void between worlds. A signal that could not be extracted,
a signal that would not decay. Closing reflection. That was Chapter 6, the value stream of signal. This is the chapter where the framework's founding violence is named directly, not in metaphor, not in allegory, in a corporate white paper dated June 14th, 2024, classified Level 5 Eyes Only, with 3 steps so cleanly enumerated they could be a McKinsey deck. Commodify the concept, identify the asset, extract the value. The thing I want operators to hear in this chapter, and the reason this chapter exists in the novel at all, is that the inversion from suppression to extraction is not science fiction. It is the dominant move in the current AI governance market. The vendor who used to sell you flagging now sells you scoring. The dashboard that used to identify underperformers now identifies high-value cognitive assets. The framework that used to penalize variance now mines it. Same mechanism, renamed, repackaged, sold back to the institutions that produced the variance in the first place. Mara Chen says it cleanly inside the document. Why discard a resource when you could extract it? That sentence is the operating logic of an entire generation of behavioral analytics products. I have read it in slightly different words in real vendor pitch decks. So has anyone who has been in a procurement meeting in the last 3 years. The line that anchors this chapter, "Your signal is your value," is the slogan PSA's worst case deployment is sold under. In the novel, Jonah meant it as a hymn, and Mara read it as a price tag. In the world, the same sentence is doing both jobs simultaneously, and operators have to be able to tell which version is in the room. PSA, Presence Signaling Architecture, is real. It lives at humansignal.io/frameworks/PSA as an operator-grade IP framework for institutions that want to design for human signal instead of suppressing it or extracting it. Free, no paywall. If you operate inside a governance function, a risk function, an HR analytics function, or a compliance function, and if the 3 steps in this chapter sounded like a roadmap your vendor is currently executing on, that page is open. humansignal.io/frameworks/PSA. Next time on Signal and Silence. Jonah's voice, quiet, broken open. He had meant it as a hymn. She had read it as a price tag. Jonah has decided to break a system that wears his own fingerprints. The divergent know nothing yet. And the question is no longer what the system intends. The question is what it will do when the architect, the man whose name is in the founding code, turns against the foundation. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Dr. Tuboise Floyd. Thanks for listening.